Well, I am glad you're here tonight. We're going to get started right where we left off there, finishing up the very last bit of Second Corinthians 7 and rolling into Second Corinthians 8. And I know that Second Corinthians 8 is a very popular topic. I know it's a popular topic because it's one of the two topics that you can guarantee if you preach about it on a Sunday morning, you'll have lots of visitors. One of those topics is sex, and the other one is money. So this will be a good one when we get started. Let's stop and pray. Thank you, Lord, that we have the opportunity to look into your word. Thank you for leaving behind instructions on how we should live and what we should do in this format of these letters. I thank you, and I pray that you'll guide us tonight. Amen. So we were just finishing 2 Corinthians 7, which is a fantastic chapter, and it deals a lot with repentance and reconciliation and Paul's tremendous joy over the reconciliation that was available. Remember that Paul had written the people what he referred to as a harsh letter, pointing out sin and inconsistency. And then he handed that letter to a person named Titus to take to them. Titus was a young man. When Paul talks about Titus, he uses the word exhorting a lot. Not that Titus is supposed to go exhort the truth, but that he exhorts Titus to do stuff. Titus is a young guy and a new guy, and he's having to be told by Paul continuously, this is what needs to be done. When Paul told him he wanted him to go to Corinth, it seems like maybe Titus didn't want to go. Titus had probably heard about these people and how they were just kind of over the top in a lot of things, good and bad. And now he's got to carry to them a letter that they are not going to appreciate. And remember that in those days, the letter carrier didn't just show up and drop it off at the door. The letter carrier was the one who read it to the group. So Titus would have had to have presented this to them. And also, as the letter carrier presents the letter, if they have any questions or comments, they direct them to the letter carrier. So if someone had written a letter to you and handed it to me, then I would come on a Sunday morning and read it to you all. And you all could interrupt me at any time and ask me what was being discussed in there, and I would have to comment on that. That was expected, that Titus would be intimately aware of the situation. So here's this young guy who seems a little timid, who hasn't had a lot of assignments, and Paul hands him the harshest letter he's ever written for the most overtop church that they've got, and tells him to go and read it to him. And on top of that, Corinth was kind of not friendly to Christian people. You can read about that back in Acts. There had been some pretty difficult situations. The townspeople that led Corinth, the proconsul that led Corinth at the time, a Roman assigned proconsul, he didn't care about what he would think of as foreign religions, Judaism and Christianity. He had no concern for them, to the point that when all of the Jews ganged up on their own leader and started beating him right in front of the judge, the proconsul just said, "Oh well, clean up when you're done, boys." And this is the situation that Titus walked into. You can imagine he would have been very particularly nervous. And yet we see, as we read in chapter 7, that things went really well. That the people grieved properly over the loss of relationship caused by their sin, and that they repented, and that they seem to have really kind of taken Titus in, and he seems to have kind of taken them in. We stopped right about verse 12. So even though Paul says, "I wrote to you," it was not because of the one who did wrong or because of the one who was wrong, but in order that your devotion to us might be made plain to you in the sight of God. I talked about that verse on Sunday, and basically what it comes down to is I dealt with this immorality because I care about you. I dealt with this because you matter to me. I have told you before about a video that Penn Jillette made. That's Penn and Teller, Penn Jillette, renowned militant atheist, when he was handed a Bible by a fan backstage, and the fan told him, I know you're not interested in these things so much, but I wanted to give you something that's very important to me, something that's valuable to me. I'm going to give you a gift. I want it to be a good one, and I just couldn't think of anything more important or valuable to me than this, and so I hope you would accept it for what it's worth, and maybe you'd read it and find some truth in there, and just left it at that. Gillette later made video where he commented on this encounter. And he'd been, beaten down in the face by religious people before, telling him what he was doing wrong and how he ought to behave. And this guy, this fan, was totally different, was gracious and concerned and loving and giving of himself. And of course, Gillette, doesn't believe in concepts like heaven and hell. But he said, if you really believe that there really is a hell, and that if somebody's not prepared when they die, they're going to go to hell, if you are really concerned about that person, if you really love that person, you're going to do something about it. He said, if you're walking down the street with your friend, and you're on the sidewalk, and your friend's on the street, and there's a bus coming, and that bus is going to hit your friend, but your friend hasn't seen it, and doesn't even believe that it's coming, and you're telling them to get out of the way, there comes a moment where you just tackle them so that they don't get run over by the bus. Yeah, that's what Paul's doing here. He's saying, because I care about you, I'm going to tell you what you need to know so that, you don't get proverbially run over by the bus. So that's what he says there in verse 12. I wrote to you so that your devotion to us might be plain to you in the sight of God. And for this reason, he says in verse 13, we have been comforted. In addition to our own comfort, we rejoiced even more over the joy Titus had, because his spirit was refreshed by all of you. You might remember that a major theme in this letter is comfort. You can go back to chapter 1, starting in verse 2, where Paul talks continuously about receiving comfort from the God of all comfort. In J. Vernon McGee's outline, he has one heading for chapters 1 through 7, the comfort of God. That, Paul had been made uncomfortable by what was going on in that church, and now he's received comfort, that the church had been uncomfortable, and now they're comfortable. It is a major theme. I don't know that it's the major theme, but it is a major theme, and that's something that Paul talks on here, is that they had received comfort. But something even more interesting has happened, and that is with Titus himself. In addition to our own comfort, we rejoiced even more over the joy Titus had, because his spirit was refreshed by all of you. For if I have made any boast to him about you, I have not been disappointed, but I have spoken everything to you in truth, so that our boasting to Titus has also turned out to be the truth. His affection toward you is even greater as he remembers the obedience of all of you and how you received him with fear and trembling. This is what I read out of that. Titus didn't want to go, as we had just discussed. Titus didn't want to be the young man with this harsh letter stepping into this group of crazy people who might do anything in a town where if he gets turned out, he could easily be attacked or worse. He didn't want to go. So Paul bragged on how wonderful the Corinthians are. Paul might not have been a trained orator, but the man is a fantastic salesman. So he explains to Titus how wonderful the Corinthians... No, Titus, don't worry about the stories you've heard. They're just the most fantastic, loving and giving and generous and gracious people, and they're going to be so excited to see you. It's going to be wonderful. The whole time Paul's thinking, geez, I really hope this turns out okay. Paul, if you remember, was so nervous about this that after he sent Titus off, he almost couldn't sleep waiting for Titus to come back and tell him. Titus couldn't just call him on the phone and say everything's going great. So upset was Paul that he went to Troas, had an opportunity to preach the gospel there, stayed there only a week before he said, I just can't take it anymore. I got to go find Titus and see what's going on. I haven't heard from him. He was really concerned things weren't going to work out well. But ever being the salesman and ever having a little faith in what God was doing in the lives of the Corinthians, he told Titus it was going to be great. And Titus found out it was, in fact, great. Titus went in a little scared, but found out that what Paul had said about the Corinthians, the good things that he'd said was good. Our boasting to Titus has turned out to be the truth, Paul says. So they ended up receiving him well, and it seems that Titus was pretty pumped. I remember just getting started in ministry, a lot younger than I am now, going to other churches to preach. I remember one time I got sent to a big Church of the Nazarene in Beaverton, Oregon. And to me, it was a big church. I don't know, there's probably 150 people there. And I was nervous. I knew the pastor there. He was a very influential guy and boisterous. One of those larger-than-life kind of personalities that had been on the district for 40 years at this point. And he called me up and asked me if I'd come. And one Sunday morning, I was nervous. I didn't know how this was going to go. I'd never been to that church for a church service before. I'd been there for some youth events. I didn't know how it was going to turn out. I didn't know what the people were going to think of me. Beaverton was kind of the hoity-toity area of town, and I got boots. I didn't know what they were going to think of me. I seriously drove up in an orange and brown Ford pickup truck. That's what I had. And yet they received me so warmly and were so impacted that even at the end of the service when I called for prayer, they just came up and started praying at the altar. It was great. I was so pumped and excited, and it was good for me as a young guy getting started to have a positive experience at one of the big churches where one of the impressive pastors taught. Well, I'm getting that impression here about Titus. He went to Corinth and things went well. He didn't get kicked out on the street and attacked and killed, and he didn't get turned away, and they didn't beat him up and abuse him. Instead, Paul says that he rejoiced that they received him with fear and trembling. In other words, when they heard the letter from Paul, they were deeply concerned and wanted to get it right and wanted to fix this relationship. And it really meant something to Titus. It pumped him up. Titus is now ready. And if you follow the kind of string of events that you see in the New Testament, Paul starts using Titus more and more and more after this second letter of Corinthians, sending him out on his own more and more, until finally we see Paul send him to Crete, where Paul tells him, yeah, they're a bunch of lazy slugs, gluttons, and drunkards. It's true, he says. That's your first church, Titus. Good luck. But he's ready because he had these experiences. Now, as Paul finishes talking about the rejoicing that Titus did, he says here in verse 16 this phrase, I rejoice that I have complete confidence in you. Now, let's just take that little line and isolate it for a moment, and then put it up against everything else we know from 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Do you think that Paul really has complete confidence in the Corinthian church? Paul just said, I boasted about you, and I'm so glad it happened. I'm so glad that the boasting worked. And now he says, I have complete confidence in you. Sounds like maybe he's trying to sell them a little something now, huh? And then we get in to chapter 8. Chapter 8 is often referred to as the explanation of Christian giving. And when preachers preach on giving, sooner or later they come back to chapters 8 and 9. And we'll be talking about some of these topics on Sunday morning, and we'll be in chapters 8 or 9. There's a couple of different thoughts about teaching on giving. One is that you probably shouldn't do it. Alistair Begg teaches on giving, he says, about once every 8 years. In his church, it kind of comes up. Some people note that Jesus taught about money 1 out of every 4 times he spoke. So 25% of the time that he had something to say, he had something to say about money. We'll talk about why here in a little bit. Some people like me, I just figure when we get to it in the scripture, we got to talk about it. But here's the thing. I don't know that chapter 8 and 9 are actually about money. The word grace, the Greek word charis that we talked about on Sunday morning, and if you missed that, it's on YouTube. It's very important. The Greek word charis, grace, is in chapter 8 7 times, and in chapter 9 3 times, in the first part of chapter 9. These sections, the chapter's division isn't exactly where you or I maybe would have put it. So if you go to verse 5 there, I believe it was, you'll get grace 7 times in chapter 8 and 3 times in chapter 9. And you won't see the term money in there at all. It's just not there. You will see him talk about giving. You will see him talk about giving quite a bit. You'll run into that term. It's in chapter 8 a few times, and it's in chapter 9 a couple of times, but it's actually not highlighted as often as grace. I mean, if you made one of those pictures that you can put all the words in the computer, and then it puts like the biggest word, and then the next biggest word, and then the next biggest word, it kind of scatters them all around, and that's how you know what's important in this section. The word grace would be huge. Giving would be quite a bit smaller. Money isn't there at all. It seems to me that what Paul is trying to communicate to the Corinthians is something about grace. Now, he's going to communicate that in the context of giving because the Corinthian church needs to be giving, and I'll tell you why. You might remember back in Acts chapter 2 where the Pentecost Sunday happened and thousands of people came to know the Lord that day. Those thousands of people we know were from all around the world. You know, they weren't just from Jerusalem. They were from all over the known Roman world at the time. Well, those people came to Christ and they wanted to stay in Jerusalem because they wanted to hear what the apostles had to say. This was all new to them. They'd never heard any of this before, and they wanted to know, and so they stayed. These are Jewish people. So they stayed in Jerusalem, and they spent time, we can read about there in Acts chapter 2, they spent time with the apostles and the other Christians of the day. And so, as we keep reading, as we come into Acts chapter 4, we find out that they had kind of built kind of a communal existence. They had sold things and were sharing things and living together. And in Acts chapter 4, we even find out that they were selling their land that was outside of Judea and bringing that money into the church, and that's how they were keeping this thing going. Remember Barnabas, who sold some land on the Isle of Crete. Was it Crete? Yeah, it was Crete. No, it wasn't Crete. Where was it? I don't remember. Anyway, he sold some land on the island he was from, and he brought that money into Jerusalem so that the people could share that and could continue moving forward in that way. You might remember in Acts chapter 6 and 7 where we talk about Stephen and the deacons, that the widows were receiving handouts from the people of the church because, of course, there was no social welfare system and the church was taking care of them. That was a great system they had going there in Jerusalem. But there were some reasons that they had to have that kind of system. You know, the Roman world at that time was pretty unified. Prior to then, it was almost like a bunch of like independent provinces that kind of took care of themselves. But most of the Roman world was pretty unified, and the government in Rome looked out for most of the Roman world, with the exception of, well, like Judea. They didn't really like Judea much, and so they put somebody in over it, but they didn't really help out much. You know, Rome had a continual problem with famines. History that we've got says that about 1 out of every 4 years, Rome struggled with food insecurity. Really, the whole peninsula of Italy struggled with food insecurity in that time. And the reason is pretty clear. If you look at the peninsula, it's very mountainous. There's really not a lot of opportunity to grow wheat there. And so Rome would purchase their wheat. Rome, the city and the province of Rome, would purchase their wheat from Egypt, which went pretty well most of the time, but of course you can't control the weather. And they also had trouble with pirates, those kinds of things. Out in Judea, they grew their own wheat. And they did pretty well with it, but they still had famines from time to time. You might remember in Acts chapter 11, we read, "In those days, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and predicted by the Spirit that there would be a severe famine throughout the Roman world. This took place during the reign of Claudius. Each of the disciples, according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brothers and sisters who lived in Judea. This they did, sending it to the elders by the means of Barnabas and Saul from Antioch down to Jerusalem." There was a famine. That famine, we know, actually took place in the year 45. Claudius was emperor from 41 to 54. He actually dealt with a lot of food insecurity and famines. He did not deal with them well. Claudius's way of dealing with famines was to look the other way and eat mushrooms. Well, people were figuring out how they were going to solve this themselves. Like I say, Rome happened all the time. Judea, little more unusual there. It was a pretty severe famine then that happened. I mean, if you're not prepared for these things, price of eggs went up astronomically. We were just talking about that a few minutes ago. And a lot of people don't have eggs because they're so expensive. But we were prepared because Wendy's got 26 dozen or something. No. And so we were okay. If you're prepared, you can deal with it. But if it's not something that happens very often, and it just doesn't happen that often in Judea. And so they were tremendously out of grain. Now, there are a number of reasons for that famine, but we're not really going to dig into that. What we're really going to talk about is what happened to the Christian church as a result of that. Now, you think about all these people coming and moving in together there in Jerusalem, and they're surviving off the goodwill of one another, and many of the Christians there, have good jobs in town, and they're kind of floating this thing until it comes out that they're Christians. A Christian in Jerusalem was a negative thing because that means they're not a good Jew. I mean, at this time, Christianity was considered some crazy sect, and these people are wrong, and they're heretical, and they're even unclean. The economy in Jerusalem at that time was driven only by the temple. Everything in there was temple related. We were talking about this in a meeting that we had a couple of days ago. It's kind of like a town where a big tech business moves in. We were talking about a particular small town where Intel moved in with a big plant there, and it just changed the town from agricultural to all of the jobs in the town relying on Intel. Even the guy that works at the taco place, he might get his paycheck from the taco place, but if it wasn't from the guys working at Intel buying tacos, he wouldn't have a job. That's the way it was in Jerusalem. All of the town was economically driven by the temple. Now, in order to work for the temple, you had to be a clean Jew in good standing, ceremonial clean Jew in good standing with the Jewish leaders. Well, anybody who'd had a temple direct kind of job was going to get fired right away when it comes out that they've decided to be a Christian. Further on down the chain, anybody that's supplying anything, say you supply cloth that then is purchased by a tailor who then makes garments that are sold to the temple, well, he can't buy your cloth because you're not a Jew in good standing. And so all these folks ended up losing their jobs. Now, to begin with, it's okay because they're all living together and all depending on one another. And people who were moving there to Jerusalem were selling their lands back home, bringing the money in, keeping everything afloat. It was going really well. The problem is eventually in a socialist system like that, you run out of money. And about the time they were running out of money, they were hit with this famine. Now they really got nothing. Well, Paul and Barnabas, back there in Antioch, when they heard about it in Antioch, they took up a collection. Who's in Antioch? Well, many of the Christians who had left Jerusalem, who had fled because of the persecution, are in Antioch. And many of them are Jews, as well as some Gentiles, but it's still mostly Jews. And most of them had some kind of history with Jerusalem. Those were the people that were helping to support this. But when Paul went out on his missionary journeys and put together a group of churches, Paul told these churches about what was happening in Jerusalem and told them that they ought to support the people of Jerusalem as well, that they ought to take up a collection as well and send it to Jerusalem. Now, this is really wild because Jewish people take care of themselves. They watch out for one another. Other people don't watch out for them. I mean, it was weird in a lot of different ways. The Gentiles of the Roman cities that he's going to, they didn't do benevolence. They didn't do charity. It was really weird to consider giving your money away to help somebody else who was hurting. They just didn't do that. I mean, if they had like a close relative maybe who fell on hard times, they might, buy him as a slave. But you don't just, I mean, listen. If they're on hard times, it's because they did something wrong. They made foolish decisions. Or maybe they upset the gods of their area. And so I'm not helping them because I'm not going to have the gods mad at me. I'm not going to give them my money so they can just foolishly whittle it away. I need it. I need to survive. I need to do well. That was just not part of the mindset of Roman people at all. And it wasn't part of the mindset of Jewish people to receive help from Gentiles. I mean, the money's tainted. It's dirty money. It's been touched by Gentiles. Why would they receive that help? Why would Paul be so concerned about the church in Jerusalem that he would go and do this? Why would the Gentiles choose to be involved? And why would the Jews receive their offering with joy, as we read about in Acts? I can think of a few different reasons. First of all, I think that Paul chose to be involved in this because he had a really heavy heart for the church in Jerusalem. We see all throughout his career how the one thing he wanted to do was go to Jerusalem and tell the people there the gospel. And I think the reason for that, besides the fact that he's a Jew and those are his people and that's his city, I think the reason for that is because the last time he was in Jerusalem, he was there to persecute the Christians. And I think he always had a heavy heart about that, and he wanted to do what he could to give back any way that he could. And also, I mentioned that Paul's a salesman. He's a really good one. He's a salesman who really thinks things through. What's going to happen if people buy this? How is it going to work? What's the end result? You know, when I worked for Safeway about 100 million years ago, when I had a car with stone wheels that I had to pedal with my feet like in the Flintstones, I went to this one particular store, and I was really young at the time, and they sent me there as the assistant manager, and everybody there was older than me, and they thought that I was just, some punk kid going to come turn the place upside down, and I was just trying to pay the rent, And I went there, and I was having real trouble connecting with the people who worked in the front end, the checkers and stuff. I was really struggling to try and get them to just work with me. There was a guy there, we called him JP. He worked the 6 to 3 shift, Monday through Friday, standing in the check stand. Dude was old. He must have been, mid-40s? Still showing up for work every day, working in the check stand. And he was kind of the de facto leader of the group, right? Well, anyway, I went up to JP one day, and I said, JP, I'm having a problem, and I wonder if you'll help me with it. But just between you and me, I wasn't having a problem. When you go up to the check stand, there's all that gum and candy and all that other stuff. Well, that stuff would come in, and I would have to have somebody put it away. And there was a person assigned to the task. She had a job that allowed her to do that, gave her a certain amount of hours to put all that stuff away. But she was busy doing something else one day, and I had carts and carts of this stuff. And JP's just standing there twiddling his thumbs, waiting for a customer, wasting time. I said, JP, I wonder if you can help me. He said, what's the problem? I said, well, I got this cart of stuff, and the lady that was supposed to do, she's really tied up today, and I don't want to just leave this. JP, do you have some ideas maybe you could come up with where we could get this stuff on the shelf and not have to, bring in extra help? And JP's like, well, let me think about that for a minute. And then after a while, he's like, I think I could probably do that. Great. Oh, that's a great idea. Thank you so much. JP started putting it away. And honestly, from that day on, he did it every day without fail. It was great. Now, the moral of the story is not that we got the gum put away. The moral of the story is all of a sudden JP was on my side. He was on my team because I went to him and asked him for help, you see. And so now I'm not such a bad guy. And now we're working together, and pretty soon we can, build a little bit of a brotherhood or brother and sisterhood with all these folks. I think that's what Paul's trying to do here. Paul's going out to these Gentile churches, and he's telling them, as you read back in Romans chapter 15, you owe your salvation to the Jews. If it had not been for them receiving Christ, if it had not been for them praying and receiving the Holy Spirit, if it had not been for them funding the missionaries that came and told you about Christ, you wouldn't know. You owe your salvation to them. And so now I'm going to give you the opportunity to give back, to help them out. And he began to build a bridge. And then to the Jews, he also built a bridge. Listen, he told the Jews, you don't even know these people. They don't even know you. Everybody says the Hellenistic people, the Roman people, are just so greedy and selfish. But look, these guys sacrificed to help you out. They don't even know who you are, but they love you so much that they dug deep and they could feel it, and it hurt them to give, and they gave to you. And he began to build a bridge and unify the church. Brilliant, brilliant Paul. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And the other reason I think he did this is because of his desire that the Gentile churches would reach maturity, that the people would mature. D.L. Moody said that you can learn more about the spiritual state of a man by looking at his checkbook than looking at his prayer book. I think he's right. John Corson puts it this way: tithing, regular, scheduled, disciplined giving. Tithing, he says, is God's way of raising kids, not God's way of raising cash. I like that. Giving makes you mature. Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I put childish things aside. I surrendered them. I gave them up. I remember when Hayden was a little guy. I can pick on him, he's not here. When he was a little guy, we had a crib for him. He got out of it. Are you surprised? Hayden got out of it really easily. We used to get up in the middle of the night, he'd be watching CNN in his diaper. And it probably scarred him for life. Anyway, so one day we got him a big boy bed. A toddler bed. A big boy bed. Well, in order to sleep in the big boy bed, he had to give up the crib. Well, what are we going to do with the crib? I don't know. We'll give it to somebody else who needs it. Okay. And then he sleeps in the big boy bed. Well, eventually he outgrew the big boy bed, and we had to get him a regular bed with a big mattress. Well, what's going to happen to my old bed? Well, we'll give it away to somebody who needs it. Oh, okay. That giving away of the childish things is just part of maturing. Before we know Christ, we are completely dependent on ourselves. We think. We are completely dependent on ourselves for everything. The more we get to know Christ, the more we trust in Him, the less dependent we are on ourselves, and the more dependent we are on Him. And the way that we see that is through how we handle our stuff. When we're dependent on ourselves, we got to have the stuff. We got to have the stuff, because how are we going to make it through the day if we don't have all the stuff? Jesus has said, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. Seek first the kingdom. I'll take care of the rest. Look at the lilies of the field. Look at the birds of the air. They don't worry about it, and they're taken care of. You can be the same way, he says. Just let me take care of it. The more mature we get as believers, the more we give. Conversely, the more we give, the more mature we get. I have seen people who have taken on the challenge of tithing, and by tithing I don't simply mean taking a 10%, although that's a real good place to start. I mean taking on the challenge of regular, disciplined giving. And they've taken on the challenge because they felt like that's what they were supposed to do. And I've seen their faith mature after that. They start doing that, they just consistently do that, and over time they grow in maturity. There was one particular lady at one particular church. She was actually a real estate agent, and she really struggled with regular giving. She wanted to tithe the 10% because that was just something she could relate to real well, but she struggled so much with she'd get the paycheck direct deposited and whatnot, and she just wasn't good at it. She struggled with that discipline. So what she began to do was every time she got money for anything, she would immediately take 10% of that as cash, put it in an envelope, right then, address it to the church, and pop it in the mail. I remember sitting there with the pastor one day. He starts opening these envelopes of cash. I'm like, dude, what in the world are you doing? He's like, nope, this is her discipline. Wow, that's cool. I knew that lady, and I watched her mature over the couple years that I hung around that church. I have also seen people who have been part of churches for their whole life, multiple generations in some cases. And they have come to all the services, and they have come to the Sunday school, and they have come to the small group, and all of this kind of thing. And I have seen where they have not matured. This person just is not growing at all. In a variety of ways. Maybe they're argumentative and they continue to be argumentative. Maybe they have a particular sin that's just got a hold of them, and they always have this sin be a hold of them. Maybe they're just not understanding, and they're not digging in, and they don't even care. And I have come to realize, I can't say in every case because I don't pay that much attention to the tithing records of my own church, but I have come to realize, it seems, and Wendy, who does, backs me up on this 100%, that those are the people who aren't tithing. That not tithing, they're not maturing. And tithing, they're maturing. Paul wants his churches to mature. And in order to mature, we've got to give. And so I think his heart is really for the people in Jerusalem, so he wants to support them if he can, any way he can. I think his heart is really for a unified church. And he knows that one way to really make them unified is to give to one another. Sacrificially giving and receiving makes a brotherhood. And I think that he deeply wants them to mature. Martin Luther said that there are 3 conversions necessary in the Christian. If you're going to be a Christian, a man of faith, a person of faith, there are 3 conversions necessary. There is the conversion of the heart that we're most used to. There is the conversion of the mind, he said, and there is the conversion of the wallet. Martin Luther said all 3 are required for a person to be a mature Christian. And that's what Paul is breaking into, I think. Why? We might not even get to verse 1. Why giving, though? Isn't there another way that I can mature besides giving? Can't I just mature in my faith by studying the Word? No, I'm not talking about, the missionary came and made me cry and so I gave. I'm talking about regular, continuous, disciplined giving. Why is that required? To the point of sacrificial giving. There was an old story about a guy who they were doing some sort of fundraiser at the church, and somebody came up to the guy and said, "Hey, are you gonna give to this fundraiser?" And the guy said, "I think I could give $10 and have it not hurt." And the guy said, "Well, then give $20 and let it hurt." Regular, consistent, sacrificial giving that you feel. Why is that required? I have 2 thoughts. First of all, because it is the symbol of our security. Money, our possessions are the symbol of our security. I don't care if all you got in the whole world is a grocery cart with a coat in it, that's your security and you're not going to let that go. Or if you're a multi-gajillionaire like Jeff Bezos, you're going to depend on that. Did I say it wrong? Is that how you say it? Bezos? Oh, well, excuse me. I don't care if you're a multi-billionaire like Elon Musk. You're going to depend on your money. If I'm given half a chance, you're going to depend on your stuff. It's a symbol of our dependency. And if we're dependent on what we have, then we're not dependent on Christ. I used to roller skate. Been a while. Last time I did was with a group of junior hires, and I used a walker the next day. But anyway, I used to roller skate. And the hardest thing about roller skating is letting go of the side wall. That's the hardest thing. You will shuffle around that thing at -3 miles an hour, getting in everybody's way, clinging to that wall. But the second you let go of it, you take off, which can be a problem if you're not ready because you'll land on your rear. But with some practice, some maturity, the second you let go of that wall, that's when you can finally go. "Oh, I went roller skating last night." "Oh, really? How'd that go?" "Well, it was really boring, and it was really slow, and all I did was clung to the wall, and I hurt myself 66 times. But if you'd let go, that's when it gets fun and exciting. And that's when things really begin to happen, is when you let go. I remember swimming at camp as a kid. There was this big dock. You just go hang on to the dock and put your body in the water and hang on to the dock. And, oh, the water's nice and cool, and you can whatever. And I remember doing that and watching all my friends swimming out there. Oh, they're having a great time. Now, to begin with, when I first got in and I'm hanging onto the dock, that was pretty fun, right? But after a couple minutes, I want to go do what they're doing. The problem is the only way to get from hanging onto the dock to doing what they're doing is to let go. If I'm dependent on the wall, if I'm dependent on the dock, I'm not going to be fulfilled. And in Christianity, it is very much the same. People who come and say, well, I tried that Christian thing, I tried the whole church thing, and it just didn't work for me. Did you let go? Or were you depending on yourself the entire time? And since money is the thing that we count on for our dependence, that's the thing we have to let go of. Oh, wouldn't it be great if it was something else and we could just talk about something else? But the fact of the matter is, that's what we have to let go of. And so that's what Paul's dealing with here. And then there's another thing, and that is that money really is kind of it's kind of the symbol of how we value our lives. You know how you get money? You sell a portion of your life. Whether it's by the hour, and so you sell an hour of your life, or whether it's by a product that you make, that you pour your life into that product and you sell it, or whatever the case might be. That's how we get money. And we value ourselves that way. Well, I'm more valuable than him because look at how much more money I make. I found out a couple weeks ago how much money doctors make. Whew. Now, I had to go meet some nice people out at the hospital not too long ago, and I found out that the radiologist makes like $70,000 a year. You got to be kidding me. And then I found out how much the doctors make. The doctors don't treat the radiologists very nicely because they're so much better. We value ourselves based on that. Christ says, I want all of you. I want your whole life. Our value is tied to what we have. How in the world are we going to give him our whole life if we don't give him the way that we value it? Do you see what I'm saying? If the most important thing to me is my time, then I need to give him my time. If the most important thing to me is my family, I need to give him my family. If the most important thing to me is the cash in my wallet, I need to give him the cash in my wallet. For most of us, it's our stuff. Remember Abraham? There were only two things that were truly important to Abraham. His relationship with God and his son Isaac. You can go back and read the stories. He's willing to give away anything else. He's willing to do anything for anybody. He's willing to risk his life. But his relationship to God is so important. He's not going to sacrifice that. And his son Isaac. All of his hopes and dreams are on his son Isaac. And what's God do? Abraham, I want you to give me your son. Is your relationship with me really number one? I want you to give me your son. We see in Genesis 22, after the event of taking Isaac up onto Mount Moriah and nearly sacrificing him to God, God said, now I know that I'm number one in your life. God knew that already. Come on, God knew that already. He's omniscient. Who didn't know that? Isaac and Abraham. And they both found out that day that God's number one to Abraham. He's not going to withhold anything. Not anything. What do we cling to? Our pocketbook, our wallet, our stuff, our lifestyle. What God come for? Yeah. Because he needs to be number one. Those are, I think, the couple of reasons that Paul is digging in with these people here. He wants them to be part of the brotherhood. He wants them to be mature. And in order to be mature, they're going to have to give away of themselves. And so he tells them in chapter 8, verse 1, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. There we go, the grace of God. We talked about this Sunday morning, that God had so filled these churches in Macedonia with grace that it absolutely overflowed out of them and affected everyone around them. The churches in Macedonia were Thessalonica, Berea, and Philippi, and probably some other ones. By the way, that area was around the same time, the mid-40s, was having an economic downturn of its own. These churches were not flush with cash. They were having some struggles in that region, probably related to the famine that was affecting the other parts of the Roman world not too far away. They were struggling a bit themselves, but they were so full of grace that it just overflowed. During verse 2, during a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and extreme poverty overflowed into a wealth of generosity on their part. Do you remember the letter to the Philippians? If you've read through the Bible a couple times, you've seen that. You know the nickname of the letter of Philippians. It's the Epistle of Joy. It's just filled with joy. I mean, Paul says, rejoice in the Lord. I'll just say it again, rejoice in the Lord. Multiple times in the book of Philippians, he talks about how fantastic things are going. Paul is writing from a dungeon, by the way, at that time, a muddy dungeon where he's probably in stocks or chained to the wall and living in a pile of his own filth, and yet he is overcome with joy. Oh, guys, he says, you're not going to believe how good things are going. Even the palace guard is hearing about Christ because I'm in jail. It's wonderful. How can he write like that to these people in Philippi? Oh, because that was their attitude. Oh, it might look like everything's falling apart on the outside, Paul, but just wait until we tell you how wonderful things are going on the inside. Oh yeah, we lost everything. Lost my home, lost my business, lost my bank account. We're barely scraping by. But you know what? Since we don't have that stuff anymore, we're maturing in the faith, Paul. He's saying, what is that it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 5? Rich man might be comfortable, but a poor man sleeps better. Yeah, this is great, he says. This is great. Well, this is the same concept. During a severe trial, that would be the economic hardship, brought about by affliction, which could include some oppression that's happened to them because they're Christians. We do know that the Christian people were not looked on positively in these three areas, Thessalonica, Berea, and Philippi. You can read about it. They tried to kill Paul in all three cities. They weren't particularly excited about having Christians nearby. It's likely that even in the midst of this economic downturn, that the Christian people had faced some difficult times. They lost property. They lost income. They were in a severe trial. And yet, they are so full of joy because of the grace of God. And their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity. That even though they really didn't have hardly nothing, they were super generous with what they did have. I've noticed that. So often I see people who are, not you people, but people I know, people who are particularly wealthy have real trouble giving it away. I don't mean they won't give. I mean they don't give because they could when they feel it. You know, they got all kinds of money throwing around $100 bills, $1,000 bills, whatever. That's pretty easy. They don't even feel it. But you know, a homeless guy with a sandwich meets another homeless guy with no lunch, and he'll gladly share half a sandwich. There's got to be a principle there, and these people are finding it. They were impoverished, but then they heard what was going on with the church in Jerusalem, and they just gave whatever they had. I can testify that according to their ability, and even beyond their ability of their own accord. What he means there is beyond what Paul thought was safe or comfortable or they should have done. Paul thought they were giving away way too much. They begged, verse 4, they begged us earnestly for the privilege in sharing the ministry to the saints. And not just as we'd hoped. Oh, we'd hoped maybe that they would become part of the brotherhood. We hoped maybe that they would grow in maturity. We didn't realize, Paul said, that they were just going to come out of the woodwork with the pittance of life savings that they have, and beg us to take it. John Corson tells a story about when the church there, it's Applegate Christian Fellowship down in Ashland, thank you, down in the Rogue Valley in Oregon. Kind of a weird area down there, by the way. Jacksonville, yeah, lots of weird. It's just different. It's very independent down there. Anyway, when they were building the building that I believe they still use, they were building it in the, I believe, late 70s. Well, they were in the process of raising the funds for the building. They were meeting there on the campus and this kinds of things. They were just getting ready to build the building. And a young lady started coming to their church who was a hippie. Like, she came with her guitar, and she was the stereotypical hippie. He said she had two possessions in the world, her guitar and a rug. And she would lay out her rug and sleep on it out under the stars, and then she would play her guitar all day. Well, she started coming to church and she met Christ, and it was like a radical thing. I mean, she was radically saved by Christ. And her life was radically transformed. And she wanted to give. And she wanted to give back to Christ because of the grace he had given her. Even her, a hippie, Christ came and gave his life for. She was so full of grace, she just wanted to give. And she said, Pastor John, I heard about the building fund, and I want to give. I want more people to know about Christ, and this building's going to help, and so I want to give. And he said, okay, and expected her to, pull out a few coins or something like that. And she took her guitar and her rug, and she said, here's what I have. It's everything I have. I want to give. And he said, oh no. This is all you've got. I can't take this. And she said, well, I'm not giving it to you. I'm giving it to Jesus. And she gave away everything she had. And he said in that moment he could relate to this. That the people here in Macedonia are giving everything they've got. This is beyond giving until they can feel it. Because, why? Because the people in Jerusalem were hurting? Yeah, that's a good cause. That's great. They were giving because Christ had given them so much. And since he'd given them so much, what if they give everything they have? He'll continue to take care of it. One of the commentators, and I honestly don't remember which one, said in the economy of God, 10 minus 1 equals 10 plus 1. Like, yeah, this is not a give to get thing. This is just simply getting your hands off of the wall and going. Let me give away the things that I have that I'm dependent on so that I can instead be dependent on Christ. They gave not just as we'd hoped they would. Instead, this is really, I think, the key of the whole thing in verse 5. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. They gave themselves first to the Lord. They were so fully, completely surrendered to God that giving away whatever they had to Paul and the group there taking up the collection, well, that was no big deal. Whatever. They gave themselves first to God. Remember a story about a revival service in one of the Central African nations 40-ish years ago. And during the revival service, they passed plates and took up a collection. Well, there was a man there, a businessman wearing a nice business suit, who had gotten saved at the revival service. And they're taking up the collection, and the plate comes to him, and he just got saved, and he's a businessman. They're expecting big money, right? The plate comes to him, and the usher comes along and brings it, and the guy says, lower. So what? And he kind of holds the plate a little lower. And the man says, no, lower. Kind of moves a little lower. No, lower. Until finally the offering plate is on the floor. And then the man got up and stood in the offering plate. I'm giving myself completely over to God. Completely over to Christ. Leave it to a new believer to understand exactly what that means. I'm surrendering myself completely to Christ. That's what they did. They gave themselves over to the Lord. Such grace he had given them, they could trust themselves completely to his hands. They gave themselves over to the Lord completely. And then to us by God's will. They felt like it was the will of God that they surrender this stuff. And so they did. I think we'll just stop there, and we'll pick it up there with that little verse about Titus. So we urge Titus, just as he begun, he should also complete among you this act again of grace. Not this act of giving, not this act of surrendering, not this act of paying the bills, but this act of grace among the Corinthian church. You are going to love the way that Paul, can I say, guilts them coming up. He really knows how to pull the strings of the Corinthians, and it'll be really good to read. We will be talking about some of these topics on Sunday morning. Always a dangerous thing, because people think that all preachers ever do is ask for money. And so I want you to know right now, I am not asking for your money. I don't need your money. None of it. I am asking for your life, but not for me. I don't want your life. But Christ does. He wants your whole life. He wants everything that you are and all that you have. And the only way he's going to get that is if you let go and go with him. And that's what we're going to be talking about. We will pick that up. Man, we covered a lot of ground tonight. 2 chapters. Well, 6, 7 verses. But still, we were in 2 chapters. So we'll keep going. Isn't this a fantastic section, though? Isn't it just great? I'm really excited about it. We'll come back to it next week. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for carrying us this far. Thank you for your grace that has brought us to this point. I pray that we would surrender ourselves and be completely yours. In Jesus' name, amen.